Corporate funding for this project was provided by St. Joseph's University, Office of Veteran Services.
Jim Kirlin was born and raised in the Mayfair section of Philadelphia. Went to Catholic grade school, then Father Judge High School. 1964, he plays in the city championship. 1965, he graduates Father Judge High School and enlists in the Marine Corps. 1966, he's in for the fight of his life when he's flown into a village in Vietnam and surrounded by the North Vietnamese Army.
John, the environment I grew up in was primarily a blue-collar neighborhood row home in the city. My parents, my father was a bartender. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. She had actually had cancer at a young age. Pretty much a blue-collar neighborhood. You know, that was pretty much my environment. I born and raised Irish Catholic. Went to St. Matthew's in Philadelphia. My mother had been full-time housewife at the time. Those days you had one parent that worked. And I had two sisters. Well, my dad's name was Jim. I was named after him, James. My mother's name was Pamela. My little sister was Karen. She was a nurse. And my sister Diane, she had polio. You know, my father was the quintessential Irish bartender, but worked in the best places in Philadelphia at the time. He was a union guy, and worked 7 days a week. 7 days a week. I never saw him ever not go to work. Sick, whatever. He was up and out and working. Sometimes he worked 2 jobs, catering, whatever he had to do to make some money. And he did have a little bookie business on the side, so that was classic stuff. My father was born shortly after his father arrived from Tyrone. They were Tyrone Irish, and then they lived in West Philadelphia. The parish, you know, Philadelphia geography, you go by parishes, and he was in Mother of Sorrows parish. It was a big Irish Catholic community out there at the time, and that's where he was from. And my mother was born in Center City, Philadelphia, and raised she went to Hallahan High School, and that's where she was from. So, and but then that evolution was we moved up to Mayfair because my mother's mother had a house up there, and her husband, which was my other grandfather, died up there in one of those deals. So that's how we ended up Mayfair. The neighborhood was great. We grew up playing basketball, and we played a lot of touch football because there wasn't a lot of grass. But we did eventually play organized football, sandlot. It was a sandlot leagues at the time. Mayfair Boys Club, Brighton Boys Club, Little Holy Terrors, baseball. But most of it was basketball and touch football. I mean, that's what it was. And we also had a lot. We would box a lot in somebody's basement or outdoors. We had a game we used to play called Body Punch. We'd stand on a line and just punch the crap out of each other's body till we couldn't go any longer, and you'd come home with bruises all over the place. But we're pretty tough kids. That's what we were. Growing up in Mayfair, it was almost like a village. You know, the fathers had, you know, they were actually pretty active in a way, even though it was all blue collar. But they had a little neighborhood bar. It had the pump in it, and you know, there was it wasn't the tap. The tap was the beer pump, and but they did what they could to support us. And you know, you went to mass every Sunday, and it was an upper and lower mass, and some of us were baptized there. And it was an emerging neighborhood because they all came from. Most of the parents came from West Philadelphia, South Philadelphia, North Philly. You know, those parishes. It was a predominantly Catholic where we lived. And Father Judge had 4,000 boys in it, and that's where the Vietnam War really had an impact, because the bodies started coming home. And that shook the neighborhood. But a lot of us were away, and we didn't really know that until we came home. My freshman year, football, we had actually an undefeated freshman team, and went all the way, played all 4 years. And then varsity my junior and senior year, and we actually ended up winning the city championship in Philadelphia, 1965.
And very calmly place kicks the extra point for the only conversion of the game by either team all afternoon, and Father Judge goes ahead 19-18 with seconds remaining. Kelly kicks off to Chimsey, who returns 18 yards.
After graduation, it's actually, there were not a lot of opportunities. I mean, I could not get into a trade. Started to go to night school, and didn't have an opportunity to go to college through athletics or anything at that time. That's another story in itself. Ended up working at a factory, actually SKF in Philadelphia, cutting pipe at night, and then going to school at night. Well, I would work 12 to 8 shift, but I would go to school at night school and then go to work on the 12 to 8 shift. Come home, and that was the cycle. So basically, high school, go to work, and I was looking at kind of a dead-end life. I mean, it wasn't something I really wanted to do.
Were you drafted into the military?
Not at all. That's what I'm saying. My work life was not something I wanted to do. A friend of mine had played football at Temple. His name was Chuck Cummings. He dropped out of Temple for some reason, and he and I decided to enlist in the Marine Corps. We went in under the buddy system in 1966.
Some have pointed with justifiable pride and call him the new breed of fighting man. But
the real experiences was when we enlisted. We flew down and we took a bus into Parris Island. We were Parris Island Marines, went to boot camp at Parris Island. The craziest day of that was that the day we graduated from boot camp, they come in, they give you your orders and your military occupational specialty. And both Chuck and I were deemed to be 0311s, which were Marine riflemen. They read out your orders. And we were assigned to Fleet Marine Forces Western Pacific, which meant Vietnam. So we knew we were going somewhere that we didn't really plan on at that time, but we did enlist, and we were committed to doing what was best for our country and what was best for the Marine Corps. I was at a Father Judge football fundraiser yesterday afternoon, and one of the Marines who had served in Vietnam came up to me and was telling me about the Marine recruiting station which was on Cottman Avenue, where I enlisted and Chuck enlisted, and a lot of Marines enlisted, as I came to find out. This recruiter had married a woman from St. Hubert's High School in Philadelphia, and he stayed. He did not leave the area. And this Marine from Judge who had met him years later, obviously, and this recruiter told him that the U.S. Marine Corps recruiting station on Cottman Avenue had the most enlisted Marines in the country, most enlisted Marine recruits in the country. He said they were so busy, so many enlistees, that they had to disperse the paperwork to other recruiting stations. He couldn't handle all the paperwork, and what it confirmed to me, and I think all of us, is that there was great patriotism at the time. There was a lot of volunteers in the neighborhood, and it was very consistent with what you saw nationally in the national. As far as I know, most of the Vietnam veterans were volunteers, not draftees. And that's a fact, as far as I've read in statistics. When I got to Vietnam, before we went to Vietnam, we went on to further training at Camp Pendleton, California, and then we shipped out, and then we actually flew from there to Okinawa, and then from Okinawa into Vietnam and landed at Da Nang. And this was around late August of early September 1966. And I was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, and Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. Served with them and then ended up with what they call a combined action company, where we lived in the village and at the end of my tour, and helped train and defend a village. It was kind of an elite unit we were with at the end.
This was the sort of operation for which all Marines are qualified. Born of time, necessity, and circumstance, and nurtured to near perfection under fire during the Pacific Campaign of...
The raid of Ban Lan was January 14, 1967. It was to be done. It was an outcome of intelligence that was acquired by our intelligence. They captured a messenger that said there was going to be a group of NVA and Viet Cong honchos, let's say generals or whatnot, meeting in this village, and it was on the edge of the Quay Son Valley, in an area on the tip of Quang Nam, in the Go Noi Island area. Go Noi Island was very famous as a route for the North Vietnamese Army traveling south out of the Northern I Corps, which was coming south out of North Vietnam. They pulled us out and they put us we went up to an LZ. They told us to travel light and that we were going to raid this village at 12 noon. And we were going to fly in these C-Knights, which are called CH-46s. I had been on 46s on a recon mission, which didn't turn out too well on December 28th of that year up in the mountains. So some of us knew what to expect, that when you're going on a helicopter and you were going to be inserted somewhere, it wasn't going to be fun. But they told us this was different, because we were going to launch a surprise attack, and they expected to be well reinforced with reinforced bunkers and spider traps, and it basically was going to be nasty. Being 18, 19, we were doing what we were told. We were just Marines. Sure, we were worried and scared and whatever, everything goes through your mind. And it's have a feeling like you're playing Russian roulette, right? Because you know when you get on the helicopter, you're spinning the revolver. Boom. You know, what's your day? Is this today? Is it today? But you go ahead, you do it because you have to do it. You want to do it to fight with your buddies, and you're there to protect each other anyhow. The United States, in a way, wasn't of any consequence. We were there to fight for what we were told and fight for each other and the Marine Corps. We get up in the air, and when we were over the LZ, all we could see was Phantoms, F-4 Phantoms, flying around, dropping smoke bombs and napalm in a kind of a ring of fire to lay down so we could make the landing safely. And when we made the landing, to our surprise, we were in about 1,000 foot by huge rice paddy and kind of a graveyard. And we had to cross that rice paddy, and it was raining. It was a dark day. The rice paddy had about 2 foot of water in it, so it was like running in molasses. When we got out of the helicopter, you sank. But the rounds from the reinforced bunkers were coming at us from the village. We had to cross that rice paddy. And all I kept thinking was, I just hope I don't get hit in the head. That's all you can think. And you move, and one Marine moves, one Marine moves. We were trained that way, to move in what they call skirmish lines, and you know, one would move, one would move, one. You just keep moving as you're attacking this village and this tree line. So after all of that, and all I could see was tracers, it looked like you know, like fireworks coming right at you, because there were like all these tracers coming, and they were going back and forth. Tracers from us, tracers from the helicopter. They were firing 50s into the village, which are anti-aircraft kind of machine guns, if you will. We had 30s, and it was loud, noisy, and difficult getting across that. And Marines were getting hit. We were getting hit before we got off the helicopters, and we were getting hit in the rice paddy. But we moved through. Some of us, one platoon got up into the village, one platoon had secured the rice paddy, and two platoons, which was second and third, which was my platoon, went into the village. We went on the flank, second platoon went into the meat of the village. After about 6 hours of fighting inside the village, we found in there were, our job was to go up, and there was a house across this pond that we had to take out. And it was like an adobe house, and to this day, we've talked about it, and it had a weird color to it. It was like I'll never forget, it was like a light yellow. It wasn't a thatched hut, it was had like a adobe, but it was across this pond. And we had to take out who was coming out of there and secure the flank of the village. It's kind of like a blocking force, if you will. The second platoon was in there, and then in our area there were these spider traps and little things all over the place of NVA, Viet Cong with pith helmets, and there were guerrillas, Viet Cong guerrillas in there too, black pajama types. It was a mixture of troops. And in some cases there was hand-to-hand fighting. I was not actually had to do that, okay? That was mostly in the village. There was a lot of that. We were close in, they were closer in. After about 6 hours, we had to get out because it was getting dark. But what was interesting is, which I've learned many years later after a meeting with, we've had reunions about this, they could not put artillery into that village because we had Marines in the village, right? We were second platoon and third platoon were in the village, so we couldn't use artillery to blow it out. You know, there were civilians in there, and they take cover and all that, but you couldn't do that. So we had to use mortar. But what the Phantoms did, the jets would come in and lay rings of fire around because they were getting reinforced from the mountains. And the FOs were saying, these guys are getting reinforced, you have to get out. And we believe there was probably somewhere about a battalion of NVA inside this village. So it was a nasty day. And I've told the story many times, so I don't cry as much as I used to. So just understand that, because we've all dealt with it. Upon entering the village, when I went into the village, I found as we entered the village, and I'm backing up a little bit, my fire team leader, Corky O'Brien, was shot and killed right in front of me. He was hit in the neck. And but he was about 20 meters in front of me. When he got hit, I thought he was wounded, went up. He was in a fetal position. He was down. We had a squad leader down. We had 2-3 squad leaders down. So what NCOs do, what Marines do, we all kind of pick up where everybody leaves off. But that day just exemplified a lot of leadership, how the assets of the Marine Corps could work together as a team. And it was for a lot of brave Marines, and our company commander, Marsh Carter, who did extraordinary things that day. He actually was a recipient of the Naval Cross for his actions that day, which saved a lot of lives. The decisions he had to make under that kind of pressure. Because had we stayed and not gotten out, like he said today, it would have been Custer's last stand. We had nowhere to go. And we had to get all our dead and wounded out all at one time out of a rice paddy as it was getting late in the night. So we got out. There was about 30, 40, I think they somewhere in the neighborhood of 30, some wounded. But miraculously, we only had 5 killed on the ground. We don't know how many died as a result of wounds after the event, but there was a lot wounded. And we had 175 Marines that made that landing that day.
Courage and endurance, a forced inbreeding that teaches the individual to respond to a command under any conditions. It's disciplined struggle for life, hinging upon the absolute control of those who command and the unswerving loyalty.
I was discharged from the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, which was Fleet Marine Forces Atlantic. That's on the East Coast. That's Lejeune. Their responsibility is the Atlantic, Mediterranean, all that, but that's where I was discharged from. And I was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps.
In America's combat readiness.
Jimmy's impact on the family, it turned our family upside down. My mother could not bear to have him in Vietnam. It was very difficult on her. My father hid a lot of his emotions. He went to work, and he worked hard. He was a bartender down in Center City, Philadelphia. And my mother didn't work, but she was ill. She had a condition called radiation syndrome. And she had radiation implants as a trial through the Lincoln Hospital. She had cancer of the cervix. My mother, she just could not handle him being away. Jimmy was her firstborn, and it was a son, and that she cherished. She cherished him. We found out about the reel-to-reel tape recorders, and they were little. So we bought 2. We sent Jimmy one with several tapes. And then that way he would record messages to my mother, so at least she could hear his voice. And that helped her a little bit. But once she found out that he was living in foxholes, that's when she had a nervous breakdown. She just could not handle it. It was very difficult to be around that, to watch her suffer like that.
But even before the 1st Battalion had begun to assemble at its barking...
Did you have any trouble adjusting to your civilian life after the military?
Well, that's a yes, but at the time, you didn't know it. It's kind of like you didn't know that I didn't know, and that was the experience of like a lot of vets who were, especially those who were in a lot of heavy combat, went through the same process. If you recall, or maybe you have to remember, John, there were not a lot of outlets for us. When we came back, there wasn't counseling. There was no avenue to say, hey, you guys have to go for some treatment or counseling. We were just kind of thrown back into civilian life. And our expectations were far different than what really occurred. So the adjustments were a process. And looking back, I didn't understand as much what was going on in my life and how what they're now calling combat-related stress disorder affected my life, because I never really was aware until about 5 years ago when I went to the VA for counseling.
And self-dependency would never arrive. All Americans in Vietnam, both military and civilian...
I can talk to you about combat-related stress disorder from an experience standpoint and how it was explained to me. First of all, it's not psychotic. It is explained to me, it was explained to me as really a deep grief. It's unresolved grief. That's one of the symptoms. The other they talk about is it's sometimes they call it fight or flight. You could be quick to anger or quick to withdrawal. And that's one of the things when you go to counseling, which is more or less, counseling was more or less to find out what was going on with your life, and you want to understand what had happened and the why. And it became pretty clear to me that it did have an impact on my life. It's the easiest way to explain it. It wasn't violent in terms of, I didn't hurt anybody intentionally anyhow, but it was more emotionally connected to some of my thoughts and experiences. One of the other things about combat-related stress disorder, vets will talk about, I noticed, is there's what we call the movies in your head. Every one of us have it's like, it was explained to me, they said, if you have a car wreck, right, a lot of people can't get back in a car. They have a hard time maybe driving a car again if it's a bad car wreck. If you've been in combat under fire for a long period of time and under that stress, and plus we didn't have any sleep, very little in the way of sleep for months. So the stress level was pretty high, even though you're 18 years old. And they said that was the equivalent of having a car wreck a week. So you can imagine what that does to you. But being young at that time and going through our process of living, coming back, getting a job, employment, trying to raise a family, you didn't really realize it had that much of an effect. But then when you look back, you can see little parts of your life that it really did affect you. But again, you always try to look at the positive side as best you could and live and try to win in terms of life, to lead a better life. But it did affect me. Or it does affect veterans who fought. It's really grief. I didn't know I had it. And you cry not so much because of you. It's because of what you know everybody else was going through. And it's something difficult to express. There are triggers that set you off. Like, a trigger could be something as simple as singing the Star Spangled Banner. That could be a trigger. Looking at children of those who have had parents killed in action, that could be a trigger. Going to a military funeral could be a trigger. For me, some triggers were like rainy days. Okay, rainy days are still difficult for me. I have to be very careful because I can get kind of down. I just don't react very well on rainy days. Memorial Day is a trigger. Most people go out for hot dogs, hamburgers, go to picnics and whatnot they're at the beach Memorial Day. My Memorial Day, I go to a service in the morning. Sometimes I speak at them. Then I come home and I take a nap. I'm tired. It emotionally drains me because you're going through this process of memory. So that's what post-traumatic stress or combat-related stress disorder. It is a form of grief. It's not psychotic at all. But there are different emotions to it too. Sometimes you react by anger.
I'm speaking with Jeff Beck. Jeff is a psychotherapist for marriage and family counseling. Primarily, Jeff deals with Vietnam veterans. Jeff, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today. One of the questions I want to ask you is about the PTSD, combat stress-related disorder. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that for me?
Yeah, basically...
Flesh it out for me anyway.
Yeah, it was started back in 1980. That's when it was officially diagnosed under the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. Now that's dictated by the American Psychiatric Association. They created a certain amount of criteria diagnosing and defining what a traumatic incident is, and from there it evolved into the DSM-4, and then they had a revision which was the DSM-4-TR, and now it is the current DSM is Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. That's what DSM stands for, and now they're in the current one, which is the DSM-5. And it breaks into criteria, from criteria A all the way to E, basically categorizing each one on what you consider to be a traumatic experience.
Primarily deal with Vietnam veterans.
Yes.
How is that? I mean, other veterans, World War I, well, you weren't around for, but World War II, they didn't seem to, I'm sure they suffered from this disorder.
Yeah, it's evolved, you know, before the actual diagnosing criteria and the verb and the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, people considered to be called shell shock or battle fatigue. Those are the kind of terms that people considered it to be, but it was never official diagnosis until 1980.
By the end of the second day, the Marines had confirmed 70 Viet Cong
For all the years that they languished with suffering whatever conditions they were suffering from, an assortment of them related to combat post-traumatic stress disorder. How is it they started to come forward now? What brought that forward? Is it Iraq and Afghanistan that brought them out?
I think there's a huge push in the aspect of mental health and mental health awareness, specifically with PTSD and how it's impacting the current generation of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. But I mean, let's face it, when they came home, they had no help. And I think that was a huge problem that kind of worsened everything for them, because, you know, you got to think 1 second you're in a combat zone for an entire year. So you're essentially your survival, your life is threatened on an everyday basis in numerous ways. And then the next day, you're back home with your family and your community. And so at 1 second you're in war, the next you're sitting on a patio. And like I said, this diagnosis wasn't even considered a psychiatric condition until 1980. So when these guys got home, they had no idea what was wrong with them. They just figured this is how it is, and I have to figure out going on from here. They had no help.
More like than the Second World War, where there was a national commitment to fighting Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. There wasn't a national commitment for Vietnam.
It was a complete opposite. You think there was so much opposition and conflict associated with this war, and another unique component to it was how it was broadcasted. You know, media was getting bigger, so people were seeing, and news was getting broadcasted faster as what was happening. So, you know, the spirit of America wasn't really behind.
And you could stay in college and go out. Where Second World War, they dropped out of college to enlist.
Yeah.
They could go to Canada, England, Sweden.
Yep.
And so you had this national divide, and nothing was made to heal the country.
And I think that's the worst part of when they came home. That national divide was really experienced by them, and every single one felt it. Whether you got called a baby killer or spit in the face or not, you knew it was happening. And when you combine combat trauma and then you come home and experience that, I mean, you can't even imagine how that can impact you psychologically.
One incident in particular, I'd been to a New Year's Eve party, and I brought a girlfriend of mine back from the University of Maryland to celebrate the New Year with me, and it was in the middle of a snowstorm I came home. And my father, a World War II veteran, served in the Navy. He was a corpsman, actually. He served on a ship at Guadalcanal. I found it in his blue book, by the way. And for some reason, I guess I had about 2 gallons of wild turkey in me, and started an argument, and the argument turned into rage. And every time I see the movie Born on the 4th of July, that was me. And it was such an overreaction, I ended up in a fist fight with my father. And I cut my arm falling down on glass. And it was bleeding so profusely with my anger, but my training in combat, I had no fear. I did what I was trained to do. I put a tourniquet on myself, and I marched and I walked through the snow to a hospital, which is about 5 miles away. About almost bled to death. Hurt my father, hurt him mentally, and a few years later he died. Lost a girlfriend, and then my own depression after that. I eventually dropped out of the University of Maryland at that time, and I was kind of lost. But somehow, during that time, at the same time, I had the good fortune to be part of a fraternity who that I joined because I needed a place to stay, and those guys became good friends. And they helped me along with that, and you know, I eventually got through all this, but there were many, many incidents like that, not only with my family, but others that were just reactions to things that were off the charts.
In your marriage to Jim, you had to go through some difficulty. Can you elaborate on those?
I guess one of the biggest events that always happens with Jim, and it has happened since I've known him, is he does suffer from serious nightmares. And to experience one of them, it's grueling because it starts out a very low kind of a moan. And you can hear the fear in the moan, and it just escalates as the nightmare goes on to almost a scream at the end. So the poor guy has really, you know, has this within him, and he can't get rid of those nightmares. They're very real, and you can just imagine what's going on in his mind as he's going through these nightmares, because it's just all coming back, what he experienced on the battlefield.
Can you sense when they come on?
You don't know when they're coming on. It's usually the middle of the night. He's usually been asleep for a while. And my method of, somebody told me that the best thing for me to do at that point is just to gently start to rub his stomach. Like, I guess, have you ever had an animal that had a, you know, nightmare? And that does seem to calm him down, bring him around, and eventually he'll wake up. But they have been constant through our whole marriage. Yeah, I guess the most recent one was probably a month ago. So they're very real, and they're very frightening to hear, because I just hear that young 18-year-old guy. You know, that's what he was when he went through it.
Are they ever physical with you?
No. No.
Why do you think that Jim married you, or you married him?
I know why. I had 2 bulldogs, Marine Corps bulldogs at the time. And he said, this is my girl, you know, she's got these dogs, she's got to be great. And Jim has been a lover of, along with I, you know, for years, of bulldogs. We've actually had 5 of them to this point in time. And one of the most harrowing experiences we had with one of them was we were having a dinner at our house, and it was a steak dinner. And Jim is a great cook. He does everything to perfection with his cooking. He's gourmet. But we sat down, the kids were asleep, and for some reason, I foolishly put a bone down with all the intent of holding on to the bone and just letting the dog eat the meat off it, because I thought I had a good enough grip on it. And before I knew it, it was so fast. The dog took it in his mouth and started to choke. I panicked, of course. I'm screaming and yelling, and Jim is trying to get the bone. He's trying to reach in, and nothing's working. And the dog is like biting his hand as he's, you know, fighting Jim, because it's just a natural reaction. And that went on until the dog actually passed out, and I thought the dog died. I thought that was it. I'm hysterically crying. Jim not says a word, sticks his hand then down into the throat of the dog and goes like that and pulls the bone out. And I'm just watching. It was like a miracle. The dog then, within a minute, started to breathe and move, and I'm crying, and I said, how did you do that? I said, how did you know to do that? He said, I did it in Vietnam. He said, I did it to one of the guys in Vietnam.
People often wonder about the Vietnam vet and think that we were baby killers, and all these things came out about how cruel we were and unjust, and I saw compassion. I saw unbelievable situations where, in one instance, we had been in a battle. It was about 3 days we had been surrounded, and it was pretty heavy fighting. And we were moving out that day, and we were moving out of the village. We had a couple of helicopters shot down, and we had to exit the village, and there was parts of it that were on fire from the bombs and whatnot that was going on, and it was just like something like you see in the movie. It was a little surreal. And we're moving out, and we hear this animal moaning, and it was a water buffalo. The water buffalo was on fire. The water buffalo is not carnivorous. They're vegetarians. So when you get near them, we can't free it because it fights like crazy. And you had to find its caretaker to take it. It was tied up in this hooch. So not wanting to let it suffer, somebody wanted it. We had to shoot it. So here's these group of Marines standing around, and we're trying to decide who's going to kill this animal to take him out of his pain. And none of us wanted to do it. Think about that. We did find one of the guys, and it's a little funny, happened to be a butcher in the Puerto Rican section of New York, Santiago. And he said, I can do it. So we walked away, and we let him do it. But none of us were willing to pull that trigger. Can you imagine, after fighting for, a couple days like that? That's the morality, that's the ethics of a soldier in combat.
And only yesterday at the Tongan Peninsula in South Vietnam. History has dictated few changes in the life of the United States Marine. His primary mission is still the winning of the battle.
It was good growing up there. It was that way, but a lot of us went in the service, and a lot of us volunteered. So we served our country, and as I said, it was either a blue-collar war or it was fought with the poor. That's who fought the war, no question.